Hi, everybody. We're back again, and obviously I'm wearing the same clothes that I wore yesterday, or in the last video, so you know that this is the same day. But anyway, today we're going to talk about the reformers of the Reformation, and we're going to talk about the three Protestant reformers today. In your notes, there's a fourth column for Ignatius Loyola, and we'll add him a little bit later. But the first person we're going to talk about is Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the guy that started the Reformation, and in his work that really began it all. So let's start with him. Martin Luther was born in those years, died in that year, and lived in Germany. So you need to make sure that you note that Martin Luther lived in Germany as well, or what is today Germany. Well, when Martin Luther was a kid, he was a lawyer, and he was a guy that really liked to worry a lot. Well, I don't know that he liked to worry, but he worried a whole lot about all sorts of stuff. And he worried about whether or not he was going to heaven or hell and all this stuff. Well, he was in law school, and he was walking to law school one day, and he was walking down the road because it's in the 1500s, and he doesn't have a car or a bicycle. And lightning strikes right next to him, and it completely freaks him out, as it would anybody. And at that moment, he says, I'm going to change my ways. I'm going to go to the church. And so at that point, he decides to dedicate his life to God and become a monk. Well, he was becoming a lawyer, which means he was probably a pretty smart guy anyway. And so he went to monastery, and he started studying. And as he starts studying, he realizes, some of the things that the church are doing are not quite right. And in 1517, he makes a list of 95 problems he's got with the church. And number one of those 95 is the sale of indulgences. He says this is a wrong thing. This is not what the church should be doing. We should not be selling these get out of hell free cards that Johann Tetzel was going around selling in Germany. So he said that's a really big deal. And things went on for a little bit longer. And finally he said, wait a minute. Not only are these wrong, but all of these other problems that are going on in the church are wrong too. And so what we have got to do, he said, what we've got to do is I've got to completely break away from the church. And he did. The problem was that the Pope didn't like that. The Pope said, you're going to be excommunicated. Well, the only way that he had power over Luther was if the German kings and the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy named Charles V, actually went and captured him and put him on trial. Well, he did capture him, and he put him on trial in what's called the Diet of Worms. Worms is a city. Diet is a council meeting, basically. And so they met in this city, and they told him to recant. They said, go against everything you just said. And Martin Luther said, no, I stand firm by what I believe, and I'm not going to go back against the church or go back against what I said earlier. The Catholic Church is wrong. We need to make corrections. We need to fix those right now. And his most significant act was starting the Reformation. Now, I'm going to skip ahead, and I'm going to go to what his specific beliefs are. Okay, we'll come back to Calvin later. Ignore those right now. All right, so Martin Luther, he basically said, I believe in salvation alone, or faith alone. That is the only thing that can save you. Now, here is how this is different from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church believed that faith and doing good deeds could save you and get you into heaven. The Catholic Church also believed that the authority on God was the Pope and the church itself, not you as an individual, and not the Bible alone. The Catholic Church said, hey, the Pope and the Catholic Church are the authorities on God. The Bible is what they get that from, but the Pope and the Catholic Church are the authorities. And that's where we get the whole idea that the geocentric world view was the accurate and right one. Well, another question was who make up the actual church? Catholic doctrine at the time said that only members of the clergy. So members of the church, priests and monks and nuns were the church, okay? Well, Martin Luther said, no, it's everybody. Anybody who believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, they also are the church. Well, what's the best kind of life? Well, Martin Luther said, whatever your calling is. You need to do whatever job you feel compelled or called to do, and that's the best. And his most significant or major text was the 95 Theses. Now, I should also add to that he also translated the Bible into German. And his translation ends up becoming known as the Gutenberg Bible, or part of the Gutenberg Bible. And it's very significant that he translated the Bible into German because, again, it brought the language to everyday people. Second major reformer was a guy named John Calvin. John Calvin fits in your second category there. He was born in 1509, died in 1564. Yeah, you can see that he's 20-some-odd years younger than Luther. and lived about 20-something years longer. Well, Calvin was in France, and just like Martin Luther in his early days, he was a lawyer, and so he had this analytical mind, argumentative mind, and questioned everything that he saw, almost by a matter of nature, and it was part of who he was. Well, he began questioning the church in France, and he broke with the church in something called the Institutes of the Christian Religion, a book that he wrote in 1536. Well, he saw that Calvin, or rather Luther, had started this change and this challenging of the church, and he continued on with it. Again, let's think back to the Renaissance. Thinking back to the Renaissance, they are encouraging questioning of traditional values. They are encouraging the individual, and Calvin continues that trend that Luther started and began with the Renaissance. Well, he reaffirmed his belief because he said, you know what? He was being kicked out and chased around France, and he had these followers who in France are called Huguenots, and that's going to play a role later. Well, he moved to Geneva, Switzerland, which wasn't Switzerland then, but was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And he moved there and he said, you know what? We're going to set up a theocracy. Now, a theocracy is government by religion. And he set up this really strict and what I would call a boring place to live. They had such rules like you couldn't play games. You couldn't drink alcohol. Which is fine, obviously, but you couldn't play games. You couldn't drink alcohol. You could have no plays. You could have no dancing. So it was a very dry place, for lack of a better word, in that, you know, it was very strict in their living. Now, his most significant act is that he did gain some followers, and he helped to spread the Reformation. We'll talk about Henry VIII in a second, but let's talk about his particular beliefs and how they're just a little bit different from Martin Luther's. Well, John Calvin said that you are saved through predestination. What that means is that God already knows who the elected people who are going to get into heaven are. It's not our choice. Okay? You're going to go to heaven, whether or hell, and that choice has already been made by God. So that was kind of out of our hands, and that's what he believed. Presbyterians today are our version of Calvinists. Okay? Our version of Calvinists. The ultimate authority on religion and all things Christianity was the Bible. He also believed, like Luther, that the community of believers made up the church. And John Calvin differs on what the best life is, just a little bit. Martin Luther said, whatever you're called to do, that's what you should do. Well, John Calvin said, no, you need to be hardworking, honest, and money-making. That God will show his favor on you by the amount of physical wealth and financial wealth that you have. And that plays a really important role in the Protestants that come to the New World, or the pilgrims, as we call them, that come to America. That plays a really important role in their life. And he wrote a book called Institutes of the Christian Religion. And in Institutes of the Christian Religion, he outlines his beliefs in predestination, a hardworking life, how government should be based on theocracy and following strict rules. All of those things are outlined by John Calvin. All right, last but not leastly of the major reformers is a guy named Henry VIII. Henry VIII, Henry VIII, I am. Well, Henry VIII had an interesting history because Henry VIII, at one point, by the way, Henry VIII was King of England. That's why he's known as the Eighth, because he was the 8th Henry that ruled England. And Henry VIII, early on, was a defender of the Pope. He, at one point, had actually led an army or sent English troops down to protect the Pope in Rome from being attacked. Well, he said, hey, I'll protect you, Pope, as long as you help me out and do some things. And that's how monarchies and the papacy related to one another. Well, Henry VIII had a problem, though, and Henry VIII had this wife, and his wife could not have a kid. And so he said, you know what? I want a divorce. And he got a divorce. Her name was Catherine of Aragon. He got a divorce from her. And so he got a divorce. The problem was, according to the papacy, according to Catholicism, you can't get divorces. Even today, a Catholic is not supposed to have a divorce from their wife. You can get what's called an annulment, but that's basically saying your marriage never existed and it didn't happen. Okay? Well, he didn't get the divorce. And so finally Henry said, well, wait a minute, I want a divorce. And I also want the church's land that they own in England. And so Henry said, you know what? I'm breaking away from the church. And he said, I'm starting my own church. And one of the things that was allowable in his church was the ability to have not multiple wives at the same time, but the ability to divorce your wife. Okay? What's significant about him is he declared himself the King of England. The monarch of England was now declared the authority of the church, and he also took lots of land away from the church. So the King of England is now the head of the Church of England, what becomes known as the Anglican Church, or if you're here in America, the Episcopal Church. And he took all the land away from the church for himself, which meant a lot more money for the crown. Now, what exactly were his beliefs? Well, his beliefs really weren't a whole lot different than Catholicism. Okay? He also believed that it was faith and works that got you into heaven. Basically, Henry VIII and Anglicanism or Episcopalianism is the same as Catholicism at this time. Okay? There's not really any difference. It's just there's a different head of it. Who's the authority on the Bible and religion? Well, according to Henry VIII, it went in this order. The Bible, then the priest or the person who becomes the Archduke of Canterbury, and then the king. It goes in that order. The king is the boss. The king is the new pope of the Anglican Church. Who make up the church? Well, anybody that follows the King of England can be part of my church, and that was what was said. What's the best life? Henry VIII said, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't care if you're in the church or not, or a priest or not, whatever you're calling. So he sort of agreed with Luther on that regard. And last but not least is something called the Supremacy Act of 1534. It's not really a major text, but it is where Henry VIII made his definite break with the church, with the Catholic Church, and said, I am the supreme ruler of the church in England. Okay, and that was the official creation of the Anglican Church in England. And it spreads later with his daughter Elizabeth, but we'll talk about that later. So I want you to think about what is Catholicism and how they're saved, who the authority is in Catholicism, who make up the church in Catholicism, what the best life is in Catholicism, which, by the way, is being a priest or a monk, and the major text in Catholicism. And think about how the Reformers' beliefs differ from those in Catholicism. All right? Have a great day. Bye-bye.